You're listening to the Transforming Society podcast. I'm Richard Kemp, and on this episode, I'm joined by Malcolm Carey, Associate Professor in Social Work at Liverpool Hope University, and Gurnam Singh, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick. Malcolm and Gurnam are guest editors of a new special issue of the Critical and Radical Social Work journal published by Policy Press. The special issue, titled Social Work and Social Control, includes research articles that discuss the delicate tightrope that social work walks between safeguarding vulnerable adults and children and existing within the confines of social, political, and legal systems that exert control over those same vulnerable people. The articles share stories from older people living in care homes, parents with learning disabilities, unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, and many other communities. The authors detail how systems meant to safeguard vulnerable people often oppress and obstruct them instead, with some having to negotiate their very existences. They discuss the devastating impact this has on people's lives, but also the hope that is coming from resistance. Malcolm Carey and Gurnam Singh, welcome to the Transforming Society podcast.
Thank you very much, Rich.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for coming on. This special issue really hits so many areas. In your introduction to the special issue, you call these articles a comprehensive exploration of how social work operates at the intersection of care, control, governance, and resistance. What do you mean by this, and can you give us some examples? Malcolm, would you like to go, please?
Well, I feel that the authors are touching upon in different ways the point that social work has become more authoritarian and control orientated, and that its regular claims to offer support and altruistic care have significantly reduced. But at the same time, as Foucault pointed out, there are always forms of resistance which emerge. And I've heard plenty of stories of social workers challenging more reductive interventions and also looking for alternatives. I was a social worker myself for many years, first in London, in Southwark, and then on Merseyside. I regularly found housing or accommodation for older or disabled adults, access benefit, advocated for families facing eviction and so on. But I wonder if social workers have the time or the resources to do this now, because so much focus is placed on investigations and also commissioning as well, the social work business as it's been termed. Crucial also is that so much of the limited support which was present in the past, and it's never enough, has been stripped away following austerity. So as the welfare state has become hollowed out, so priority is given to more serious cases, which so often lead to the outcomes we and other authors in the special issue have discussed. What's left is a focus on investigations, removal of children, sectioning, placing older adults into care homes, and so on. And this is not the reason why most people enter social work. Essentially, social workers are now responding to the crisis of the hollowed out welfare state. I think the other point I want to make is that social work is also the most class-specific welfare profession, although the police and youth workers also engage predominantly with the poor. And also, finally, that there is resistance, but it tends to be occasional and quite limited.
You say about it being hollowed out following austerity. How is that, and about how it's class it greatly affects class. How has the hollowing out affected the working classes?
I guess that there's kind of people, maybe they become more desperate, maybe there's more stress in families, maybe some people turn to crime. There's a whole range of different things that can happen. But if somebody is living in poverty, they're likely to become more desperate. And I guess that also crucially in social work, the support that's really important to people. And people only ever turn to social work for support as a kind of a last desperate measure. It's not something that people really choose to do because there's always been a stigma attached to social work, which there isn't necessarily in other countries. So I think those types of stress, social stresses and so forth is part of the reason why the kind of and the other point I want to make is about the fact that social workers are under significant legal pressures as well. You know, the Children's Act and so forth, which means that if they don't intervene, there is the risk of kind of shame or further investigations beyond social services. So that again is not a helpful scenario.
If I can just come in there, Rich, maybe just to pick up on, I mean, Malcolm's really kind of set out the kind of terrain in which we approached this special edition. I mean, social work is an intensely political profession with a small p, in the sense that it functions within the intersections of power, control, coercion, and ideology. And what I mean by that is even the idea of the welfare state, the idea of welfare itself, has always been shifting according to political currents. So, from its inception, I think social work had always had to deal with these kind of challenges, but I think it's been particularly kind of become more challenging under what you could call the kind of neoliberal reforms that took place throughout the 80s and 90s, where not only were social workers demonized, partly because the people that they work with were demonized, but also the idea that somehow care needs to be privatized, taken away from the state. And so you've got this kind of slightly confusing thoughts about what is the role of the welfare state itself, within which social workers are, trying to, practice their professional ethics, where you're often pushed in a different direction. I think it's kind of it's almost like kind of a, kind of Hobson's choice, and we do try to explore how social workers creatively and in other ways are trying to, balance these two kind of pressures on them.
Malcolm, in your article with Lindsay Constance, you say as of 2021, 80,850 children and young people were in care in England, a recorded high, and that parents with learning disabilities are the most likely to have their children taken away. You also say in that article, you describe an environment where social and support workers receive little or no training for assessing parents with learning disabilities. How does this environment play out for parents and their children in day-to-day life?
I guess, as I mentioned before, social workers are under significant pressure to safeguard children due to policy-based and legal requirements, and also the impact of the media as well. And they have limited time and resources. There is a fear of any consequences of what might happen if a child is not brought into care or if something goes wrong. And obviously, I think also it's a moral instinct to want to protect children who appear to be vulnerable. But I guess what emerged from the research, and this echoes the international evidence, is the lack of resources for families and for social workers, the lack of training as well, and the general support given to parents with learning disabilities to keep their children. There is also evidence of assumptions that not just social workers, but also more generally among other professionals, that parents with learning disabilities are not going to be able to cope with the demands of parenting, and that family support can help. But one of our key arguments is that many parents with learning disabilities, especially if they have significant support from the state and also they have a good family around them, are likely to be able to do a good or good enough job as parents. It's a very complex issue, however, because every family and child tends to be different, and it will differ from family to family and child to child. But also, class is important in terms of the role of the social worker, as I said earlier. But the reality is that children who come into contact with social services, will more likely be working class and economically disadvantaged. But we also know that class is important as you're more likely to be brought into care the lower down the class structure you are. And also, Section 47 inquiries, when social workers investigate possible child neglect or abuse, increased significantly from 111,700 in 2011 to 198,790 in 2021. So the investigations have, I believe they've leveled off more recently, but this is the environment in which social workers are working. And with very limited resources and such significant pressures, it's no surprise really that so many children who have parents with learning disabilities are brought into care, sometimes even before they're born.
Wow. How does that work?
Well, I suspect it will be a health professional in a hospital will alert social services. Normally, there's a social work department in a hospital.
Can I just add to that as well? Again, if in terms of the deeper, if you like, the kind of ideological kind of environment, not too long ago in terms of human history, we had policies of eugenics, which was basically, how can we not even take into care, but erase, even the birth of people with learning disabilities. And, we know that, we were just recently commemorating the Holocaust, and, part of the policies of Nazi Germany was to get rid of defective individuals. And those ideas came, they came through from the States earlier on, and there were clinic and social workers were involved in this. And there are writers out there who are saying that the kind of the broad kind of philosophical thrust of eugenics hasn't gone away. This idea that somehow we can, by all kinds of medical interventions, maybe not the kind of brutal ones that we witnessed during the Holocaust, but other, more selective, we think about epigenetics and things like that, and genetic screening, that we can get rid of this problem. So when you've got this narrative, then it becomes even more challenging to make a case, a positive case for people with learning disabilities. And I think and I'm very fearful of the way in which the Trumpian kind of logic now, and across Europe as well, right wing, who are saying we haven't got money for welfare, whether we might see a kind of a targeting of these kind of client groups themselves. And I think, clearly social workers again are on the front line now.
Malcolm, staying with your and Lindsay's article, you quote some adult social workers as saying they hold parents with learning disabilities to higher expectations than parents without disabilities. It's not enough for a parent to say, I can cook. They need to prove it. Where does this culture of holding parents with learning disabilities to higher standards come from?
I think the parents with learning disabilities have to prove that they can cope with the demands and complexity of parents, but the social workers are under, as I mentioned, incredible legal and policy-based pressures to ensure the safety of children. It also depends very much upon the case, but so little support and training is now available, and the benefits being reduced all the time and so forth. It's likely to be a real challenge for parents with learning disabilities to be able to cope. So, family support will help, as I also mentioned, but more and more formal support provided to people is being privately funded as well, which is another issue in the background, so to speak. So the class divisions, which have always been there and present, are becoming harder and more intense, really, in terms of the support provided. I seem to remember that I think David Cameron had a child with a learning disability, and I'm confident in believing that the social workers would not likely be investigating the family, possible removal, and the child being brought into care. So the class dynamic is so important in social work, as are other kind of influences around things like gender and race.
All these legal and political pressures that social workers are under, having to meet all these demands, while also presumably trying to do their work as a social worker. What effect is that having on kind of the social workers of the future? The ones like it is it having an effect on whether pupils and students want to get into the profession of social work?
I mean, the trends that I've noticed over the years are that we don't have any problems with applications. We don't have any problems maintaining students on programs. The eagerness is there. But what you do notice is that when students return from placements, there is a change. And I think that they kind of, some of the negativity out in the environment, the working environment, some of the optimism, some of the idealism has evaporated when they come back. There's also strong evidence that recruitment isn't the problem out in the working environment as well, where the social services departments receive plenty of applications, but retention is an issue for the very reasons I'm talking about. The excess bureaucracy, the regulations, the lack of resources and so forth means that retaining social workers become quite a critical issue around the country. And that's been the case for some time now.
Could just add to that as well, Rich. I think I mean, when I came into the profession of social work back in the 80s, it was a wholly white middle class profession. It has changed now. It's much more diverse, and that's a good thing. There are more working class people like myself in the profession, and there are more kind of people from different ethnic minorities, which is brilliant. However, I think what we also have is it's a bit like kind of almost replicating the kind of patterns within the NHS. We tend to find a lot of workers who are from overseas, maybe, and there's some authorities have been recruiting from overseas, but also, maybe staff who come over as asylum seekers or refugees or immigration, and it's almost like a second career. So that's been a boom for social work, because a lot of social workers come from, say, Zimbabwe, from Africa, and from other countries, India. They're actually highly qualified and highly motivated. So that's a good thing. But I think it has become a bit of a Cinderella profession as well. It's become a neglected profession. I think, as Malcolm says, I think the fact that it's no longer a kind of white middle class profession, I think it's become vulnerable to all kinds of attacks, particularly from the kind of gutter press, I think, from the tabloid press. And it's a kind of like almost a kind of a heads I win, tails you lose. But that's the reality that we've got to deal with.
Gurnam, in your article with Deborah Hadwin, you discuss unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, many of whom arrive in the UK in urgent need of support. But the support workers meeting them, you describe as in a culture of skepticism and mistrust, even believing without evidence that many children look too old and are not children at all. Looking wider, there's this narrative in the UK of the deserving citizen and the undeserving migrant. What's fueling this narrative so much so that even our support workers are influenced by it?
That's a really complex question, and we tried to kind of deal with that within the chapter. Now, just to let you know, the chapter was based on primary research that Deborah had done for her PhD. So lots of really interesting stuff. But before I go into that, I think it's probably worth just setting out what this notion of the deserving and the undeserving citizen. It's a public policy narrative that's been framed around government policies regarding social welfare access to resources and allocation of benefits. So this idea that really public welfare should only be given to those people who deserve, typically somebody who's perceived to have earned or is worthy of public support, yeah? Often portrayed as, they deserve because the factors that have led them to the need for welfare weren't their creation, yeah? It could be that they were just vulnerable, like young children, but even adults, that they've kind of just fallen into this kind of into this situation. And of course, on the contrary, the undeserving is somebody who has created their own problem themselves, maybe, and therefore they don't deserve to be supported. And clearly, the kind of policy implications are there. And of course, the undeserving citizen is the one that's going to be subject to social control, surveillance, and the kind of things that we were talking about, and even incarceration. And if we now turn to the kind of experience of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, we can see both narratives at play here. So, for example, if we think about the deserving, and so the social workers very much were using these kind of arguments that these are innocent victims of war, of trafficking, children. And because of their age, that they're exposed, and we have a model duty, and here reference is made to the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, and also the 1951 Refugee Convention that mandate that children should not be turned away if they're fleeing danger. Yeah, so you've got this kind of powerful mandate to support these young people, but then you've got this kind of other side, and much of this is a kind of a media model panic. That asylum-seeking children are actually young adults, maybe some of the stuff, because age assessment and age disputes was a big kind of political football, that these people are not really children, that they just pretend to be children, particularly maybe those that came from Afghanistan and places like that. And of course, this then kicks into, well, why should we be providing them? And you've seen all the model panics around, asylum seekers being housed in hotels and things like that, and so you've got these tensions. Now, the point that we were making, and this was quite interesting. When Deborah did her field work, she approached it on the basis that she was expecting maybe the managers to be a bit harsh, the kind of people who are controlling the purse strings, because they're kind of, as it were, under the cosh from government policy. And the frontline workers have been very sympathetic to the young people that they were working with. But what we found was quite a mixed picture. We did find many of those frontline workers being extremely sympathetic, using all kinds of creative ways to support these young people, to trying to resist the kind of so they had to do these age assessments and how they could try to resist kind of being tempted into this kind of coercive approach. But what we found also, others, and maybe they were internalizing some of the wider rhetoric, because we're all kind of subject to that, those, if you like, tabloid press kind of represent. And some of them were actually saying, look, I don't think this person really is the age that they claim, and I'm not sure how to believe them. So we did find levels of mistrust as well. And if we looked at the managers, I think again we found both those managers who said, look, we have to allocate resources, and we have to try and allocate them according to who deserves the most. So they might use these arguments to cut back on, say, specialist teams that were working with unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. But what we found also were managers who were actually very sympathetic and were defending the rights of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and the social workers. And so they would use all kind of creative methods to be able to maintain those services, maybe by not designating it as a specialist team for unaccompanied asylum, but still having those workers, working on those things. So, I mean, Michael Lipsky back in the 80s wrote a book called Street Level Bureaucracy. And so these managers are kind of like what he called street level bureaucrats. And, they did actually have quite a lot of power and control, maybe less power and control than social workers do, but they still have that. So what you find is in the whole, broader kind of debate around control and care, you find these professionals, whether they're managers who are controlling resources or whether they're frontline professionals, kind of working in a minefield. And, some of them step on the mines and some of them find their way around. And it's quite a kind of mixed bag, really. But it's a difficult area of work. And, I think that's what we were trying to kind of portray in the whole piece, that social work isn't a common sense activity. It's not that, caring is just about caring. Actually, when you look at the kind of terrain and you look at the context in which the caring is delivered against, the most vulnerable in society, it's a hugely complex task. And, I think we do need to defend social workers as well, and the way they try to meet their legal obligations, their kind of policy, and then they've got their own ethical frameworks. And what we found was, in terms of unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, that one of the tools that social workers were using, and this was really music to my ears as somebody who's been teaching social workers about the importance of professional and ethical frameworks, but they were more willing to use that as a way to defend their actions, even if that went against the policy that was being pushed by the local council. And I think we can learn a lot of lessons from medical professionals. A medical professional will be working for a local hospital or a trust or whoever, but they will always say that my accountability is to my professional body and ethics. And if that means going against a local trust, I will do that. And I think, but you do need a lot of confidence for that. And I think that's where maybe some of the social workers were falling down, that they didn't have the confidence to assert their own authority.
Gurnam, also from your article with Deborah, there are support workers who are resisting the norms of skepticism and mistrust towards unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. What are these people doing to support young people against this hostile system?
Well, I mean, I think they're wide range, from practical support, enabling them to, get telephones, for example, really important. Although I think you might recall some of these model panic stories about they have mobile phones, these, as if, that's a luxury. Often the mobile phone was the most important thing for them, because that did enable them to remain in contact with people, for their maybe families and stuff. So they would provide that kind of practical support. They would also be empathetic. And I think that's really important, because ultimately, I mean, many of those did achieve asylum. Yeah, they were. And in fact, some of the research was with those who had kind of gone through the system and they'd kind of became adults and they were living and working. And they were saying that, that kind of that believing us was really critical to our survival, our mental health. This kind of, accepting us as we are, rather than, maybe suggesting that we shouldn't have left our country, or somehow we were choosing to come to England, which is where the kind of undeserving model pan. But that said, I think that as I was saying, we're all subject to those kind of pressures, aren't we? And and that's always a danger, is that we succumb to the kind of stereotypes out there. And there were some social workers, these were from, they're a different kind of professional. They weren't professional social workers. They were people who work in a kind of more care function. Some of them were saying, look, these people have got it better than I have. I can't afford X, Y, and Z. So I think there was that kind of personal, I don't know, kind of feelings coming in as well, which is kind of understandable. It's a bit like, I suppose, it's a bit like the impact that UKIP has, UK independence, that they've had reform, have had on drawing in working class people, poor people, into what might be at a right wing kind of agenda. It's populist, and populism does, impact professionals as much as anybody else.
You were saying about the mobile phone, for example, that it could be seen as a luxury, and you mentioned UKIP and reform at the end there. That kind of the rhetoric, the heinous rhetoric that gets thrown around about anyone migrating to this country through, kind of seems like through any means. They don't just want to go for asylum seekers anymore. They seem to want to go for everybody. And you mentioned about class there at the end there. Is there a kind of the class struggle? They see things like an unaccompanied asylum seeker receiving a mobile phone, and it kind of feeds into the rhetoric machine that's been building for years. Is there something in that?
I think it's important that we don't see the working classes as this kind of unthinking kind of lumpen proletariat that somehow, feed them something, they'll react. In fact, what you find is, in local communities, many kind of working, because of many of these unaccompanied asylum-seeking children and asylum-seeking families more generally are placed in working class areas. Yeah, so you get both narratives. You get those narratives where someone will say, "I've been, on a housing list for many years and I can't get housing. These people come in." That's the kind of Nigel Farage kind of model panic. Yeah. But then you get others who get to know those families, and actually they become part of community, and you find that they're actually part of the resistance to support these unaccompanied asylum-seeking children. Well, and as they become adults, so you find that within the working class, you find both kind of reactions, which is kind of natural, really, because that's how it is. You find both empathy and, if you like, some kind of antagonism as well. But the kind of broader political climate is that we know that immigration, asylum is a kind of topic that's constantly being used by policymakers and governments. And at the moment, it's we are in a kind of really difficult situation. We've seen what's happened with Trump in America, where he's almost kind of on the verge of having these internment camps. Any illegal alien. I mean, we're back to the aliens now. In Germany, we've got a reaction. We've had in the UK. The Tories and their Rwanda policy, which has failed. That somehow we've got to keep people out. Now, I'm not saying that we should just have an open door policy, but we need to understand both. And in this sense, I'm using the analogy of in the health service. We need to look at what the upstream factors and also what's happening downstream. And of course, this is where I think for social workers and policymakers to have an international perspective is really important, because the truth is that people don't choose to risk their lives to come across the channel or send their children across on these boats. They do it because they think that their life is more secure, even on the choppy waters of the Channel or the Mediterranean, than they are where they live. And I think we need to therefore think about international obligations, and clearly conflict is a big issue, and so international social work has a crucial role to play, both in terms of how we can move away from, I think Malcolm touched on it earlier on, this almost all that social workers do is downstream, kind of rescuing or controlling people, to social workers influencing wider policies. I think that's really important. And we do have the International Federation of Social Work that have been doing that. A good example of that, I know it might be a slight digression, but the issue of Gaza at the moment, and the kind of violence that has been, systematic violence against the children of Gaza, has really kind of created tensions amongst social workers internationally. But I'm pleased to say that they're still united. They say that, we need to be united against all forms of oppression wherever they are, because the social work profession, in a sense, that's its primary raison d'etre.
Your special issue shows how social work is both an instrument of the state and also an advocate for social justice. You touched on this a bit earlier, and I'd like to hear more if I can, please. How can we ensure that social work is focused on safeguarding and not on perpetuating prejudices over vulnerable people?
Sadly, Rich, even the safeguarding leads to further investigations, as I kind of referred to. But I still believe that most pedagogues in social work and students and many practitioners still champion humanist and critical paradigms. But that those very approaches have very little influence in fields of practice where neoliberal and more conservative values tend to prosper. Are also acts of resistance, and it includes from service users themselves. And I still believe that free market capitalism is ultimately the problem, and not service users, as we're led to believe in certain practice-based environments. I guess the other point, which we haven't had a chance to talk about because of time, is that there were two articles around older adults. And I think it's important to bear in mind that older people are now the largest service user group who are referred to social work departments because we have an aging population. And, people are being drawn into care. We have a situation where we have, potentially more cases of people with dementia or Alzheimer's and not enough carers to support those people. We have people being kind of, bunged into care homes against their will and so forth. So for me, a lot of the future around social work will be around the aging population. And it goes back to the same point about not responding to crisis, but making sure that there's enough preventative care there to avoid the kind of the safeguarding investigations and very superficial acts of intervention.
Yeah, I mean, Rich, I might just follow on from Malcolm there. I think that last point is worth kind of repeating. Social work should be working upstream as much as it's working downstream. We're not just here, as it were, to pull people out of the water that are drowning. We need to try and work at stopping them being falling into the water in the first place. And I think this isn't just a debate around social work and social care. It's a debate within health. Yeah, the idea that we need to focus on health rather than sickness. So that's the first point. I think that's really important. And that means, the re-establishment of community-based social work. I was just reflecting on some work that I'd done in Chennai, in India, Tamil Nadu state, and how social work there, in child protection, most of the kind of stuff that we do here in terms of safeguarding of children, they said that they wouldn't actually intervene for those factors, like maybe where you've got low level chastisement of children, maybe even the use of physical violence and even emotional kind of abuse. They said that would be seen as a low level. What we tend to do, they said in there, is we'll work at the village level. We'll work with communities through community education, through health education, and through education of parenting, and they found, and most of all, empowering of women. Yeah, actually enabling them to have income, and they found that had huge benefits in terms of child protection and safeguarding. And they said that if we were to police every kind of behaviour of every parent, we just won't be able to do it. We need millions and millions and millions of social workers. And that's true if you think about it. For every one case that comes to light to social worker, there's probably another 10, 15, 20 cases that don't come to light. So I suppose the question is, does social work have a role for those people? And if so, how can we reach them? I think that's a really important point. And the other point, last point I would make, is that social work can't be ambivalent about its moral and ethical duty. Social workers are working with the most vulnerable in society. By definition, these are people who have, in a sense, fallen through the net, who can no longer care for themselves. And then, social workers can't go in that kind of space and think, oh, well, do these people really deserve our care? Once you get into that, you've lost the plot. And, and I think that, thankfully, I think most social workers that I know of and are still, steadfast on their commitments to social justice, and long may that continue.
Oh, Malcolm and Gurnam, thank you so much for coming on the Transforming Society podcast today and discussing your special issue. It's such a great issue, and yeah, excited for everybody to go and read it. Social Work and Social Control, the special issue for the Critical and Radical Social Work Journal, guest edited by Malcolm Carey and Gurnam Singh, is published by Policy Press. You can find out more about the special issue by going to bristoluniversitypressdigital.com or transformingsociety.co.uk.